This is the last session of this afternoon, and it's my pleasure to introduce Sloan Despeaux, who will be talking about women alongside the great men of mathematics, the case of Caroline Eustis Seeley. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. First of all, I would like to thank June, Chris, Adrian, and Troy for organizing this INI research program on the modern history of mathematics and allowing me to speak at this opening workshop. I'd also like to thank the INI for making this program possible. I mean, what a dream to just have coffee. The most exciting thing is when you're walking into town and just see eminent historians of math on the sidewalk. It's such a wonderful, wonderful experience. I really appreciate the opportunity. I would like to thank my colleagues that I've been lucky enough to work with on our highly collaborative research project surrounding Oswald Veblen. This talk comes from my research subgroup's contribution to the project. So specifically, I would like to recognize Ellen Abrams and Ben Braun. As you know, speakers in this workshop were asked to address the question, what do you consider to be the most significant open question or lacuna in your area of the history of mathematics? With the Oswald Veblen project, my area of the history of mathematics has recently drifted a little over to American mathematics of the 1920s, a decade beginning what Karen Parshall has aptly characterized as a new era for the American mathematical research community. At Princeton's Mathematics Department, the Institute for Advanced Study, the American Mathematical Society, Oswald Veblen played foundational roles in this new era for American mathematics. While the great men of American mathematics of this period, like Veblen, have rightly received attention from historians, the women working alongside these men have remained largely unknown. Thus, the open question I would like to address is, what were the roles and contributions of the women who worked alongside the great men of mathematics? As a case study, I will consider Caroline Eustis Seeley, who served for over 2 decades as the clerk of the American Mathematical Society. Seeley's career trajectory intersected with Veblen, especially during his tenure as president of the AMS for the calendar years 1923 and 1924. This case study is not the first investigation of Seeley. In fact, Jim Tattersall and Sean McMurrin recently published a survey on Seeley in the notices of the AMS, and they have really generously shared their manuscript scans and notes with us. Ellen Abrams has also published interesting scholarship on Seeley. She joined our working group and brought her own archival work, as well as this picture of Seeley shared with her by Seeley's great niece. So, let's begin this case study with an ending. On October 29, 1934, Secretary of the American Mathematical Society, Roland George Dwight Richardson, wrote a letter that began, "Dear Dr. Seeley, I have received with regret your resignation as clerk of the American Mathematical Society." He added that the society will not seem to be the same organization without you. Days later, the AMS Council passed a resolution expressing its great regret on learning of Dr. Seeley's resignation. No one who has been associated with the work of the Society can fail to have appreciated the unfailing devotion and notable skill with which Miss Seeley has carried on her diverse, complicated, and frequently taxing task. In regretfully accepting the resignation, the Council expresses to Miss Seeley its high appreciation for her signal contribution to the cause of mathematics. Richardson's use of Caroline Seeley's formal title, Doctor, and the Council's use of Miss speak to the expertise, challenges, and tensions that defined Seeley's career at the AMS. She earned a PhD in mathematics from Columbia University in 1915. Although Seeley's credentials as a research mathematician were not always recognized, they were often essential to her work at the AMS. Following these heartfelt pronouncements from the leadership of the society, Seeley, then only 47 years old, moved forward with her retirement plans. She wrote, "I am leaving the society's office on April 1st to start a chicken farm. My friends tell me this is a very appropriate day for such a move." While Seeley was planning her retirement, Oswald Veblen, 7 years Seeley's senior, was reaching new heights in his career at the Institute for Advanced Study. While the career paths of Veblen and Seeley radically diverged in 1935, they had earlier experienced a synergistic intersection, especially when Veblen had served as president of the AMS. Veblen's strong diplomatic connections to mathematicians worldwide and his skills as an institution builder, combined with Seeley's outstanding administrative skills and her deep institutional and social knowledge, formed a partnership during Veblen's years as AMS president that would shape American mathematics for decades to come. Seeley completed her undergraduate studies in 1911 at Barnard, a women's coordinate college with Columbia University, and there she earned honors in mathematics. She then completed her doctorate in 1915 at Columbia with a dissertation titled Certain Nonlinear Integral Equations, advised by Edward Kastner. Kastner was notable for his advising of women doctoral students, having advised 5 women doctorates between 1915 and 1942, including half of the women doctoral graduates from Columbia prior to 1940. In their study, Pioneering Women, Judy Green and Jean Leduc showed that over 100 undergraduate institutions produced undergraduate women alumnae who received mathematics PhDs prior to 1940. Over a quarter of these women completed their undergraduate work at the 6 women's colleges of Wellesley, Goucher, Hunter, Mount Holyoke, Vassar, and Smith. Barnard was not among the top 6 women's colleges listed here. It had only 3 graduates to go on to complete a mathematics PhD before 1940. In fact, the other 2 Barnard alumnae received their mathematics doctorates in 1931 and 1935, well over a decade after Seeley had completed her degree. Thus, in completing a PhD in mathematics, Seeley was an outlier among her Barnard peers. As a coordinate college of Columbia, Barnard was also somewhat of an outlier. In fact, the male faculty of Columbia taught the courses at Barnard, unlike was the case at many women's colleges. Thus, Seeley couldn't follow a common path of other women mathematics PhDs at the time and returned to teach as a professor at her undergraduate alma mater. She was, however, able to utilize connections that she made as an undergraduate to forge her own career path. As a graduate student at Columbia, Seeley worked for her former undergraduate professor, David Eugene Smith, as a mathematical assistant at Columbia's Teachers College. Besides being mathematics chair at the Teachers College, Smith was librarian at the AMS, which housed its library and its records at Columbia. When Seeley began working for the AMS in 1913, she gave credit to Smith for helping obtain the position. "I am enjoying my new work very much, thanks to you, but I'm afraid I'll be rather homesick for Teachers College." Smith was not the only collegiate connection for Seeley at the AMS. In her new role at the Society, she worked closely with the Society's secretary, Frank Nelson Cole, who was also a mathematics professor at Barnard. Seeley began working as a clerical assistant for the AMS in 1913, at a time when the Society was in desperate need of reliable staff. Founded at Columbia College in 1888 as the New York Mathematical Society, the AMS was reorganized as a national organization in 1894, largely because of the strong presence of mathematicians at the University of Chicago and elsewhere. Between 1888 and 1920, there was tremendous growth in the AMS membership and participation. During the first year of Frank Nelson Cole's tenure as Secretary of the Society in 1895-96, for example, 22 authors presented papers at Society meetings. During Cole's final year as Secretary in 1920-21, 119 authors presented papers. The significant growth of the American mathematics research community necessitated organizational growth within the AMS. Looking back in 1938 for his semi-centennial history of the AMS, Raymond Clare Archibald deemed it astonishing that a regular clerk had not been appointed to assist Professor Cole until Seeley's appointment in 1913. It would soon become apparent that Seeley was much more than a regular clerk. Within 2 years of her appointment, she had completed her PhD in mathematics, been elected a member of the American Mathematical Society, and initiated a long-term research program in functional analysis. While working full-time at the Society, Seeley continued to foster an active research program. Indeed, with 4 publications, she was among the most research active of the pre-1933 women in American mathematics, according to Green and LeDuc. Seeley's work included 3 research papers published in the Annals of Mathematics in 1919, 1928, and 1930, and a paper published in the Bulletin of the American Mathematical Society in 1931. While the Annals did not in 1919 have the research reputation that it enjoys today, it was on an upward trajectory during Seeley's time publishing there. Seeley was particularly active in meetings and presentations, being one of only 9 women with pre-1934 PhDs who had 4 or more published articles that had been first presented at an AMS meeting. Between 1914 and 1935, she's listed 74 times for her participation in AMS meetings. While she didn't stray far from the topic of her dissertation, kernels of integral transforms, Seeley maintained an ongoing research program for over 15 years after completing her doctorate. It might seem remarkable that Seeley's research productivity took place while she was employed as a clerk in support of the mathematics profession rather than in an academic context. But her position at the AMS involved much more than clerical work. In some ways, Seeley's position at the AMS provided her with an increased access to the research community at a time when women's work in science was being intentionally constrained. Thus, her position may actually have increased her access to the research community compared to women in often teaching-focused academic positions. In the early years of her employment at the AMS, following the United States entry into World War I, Seeley worked for the Army Ordnance Department in Washington, D.C., under the direction of F.R. Moulton. It's well documented that the employment of mathematicians in support of the war effort was a critical ingredient to the growth and development of American mathematics in the interwar period. Over 60 mathematicians served at the Aberdeen Proving Ground under the command of Oswald Veblen, while Moulton directed a team including 8 women at the Ordnance Department, making substantial contributions to the mathematical underpinnings of ballistics modeling. Seeley's wartime employment occurred during the same period as her initial work at the AMS. By 1921, Seeley had made herself so indispensable at the AMS that she was the subject of a minor uprising surrounding the possibility of her resignation. The positions of editor-in-chief of the Bulletin and secretary of the AMS were for over 2 decades held by the same person, Frank Nelson Cole at Columbia. In 1921, Earl Raymond Hedrick at the University of Missouri took over the editorship of the Bulletin, and Roland George Dwight Richardson at Brown University in Rhode Island became the secretary. Seeley's position as assistant to the secretary now expanded to assist both men. As neither lived in New York, a proposal had been made by the AMS Committee on Reorganization to decentralize the work of Seeley's New York office. While he recognized her exceptional ability, Hedrick wrote that Seeley's job of doing the work for a half dozen men at a great distance, each one ignorant of the demands of the other, must be trying to say the least. He itemized her responsibilities in regards to the Bulletin as reading proofs, collecting materials for the notes and the list of new publication sections of the journal, as well as the annual list of published papers, receiving and distributing books for review, keeping the mailing list current, and compiling the index. He wrote that he would have been fine with, quote, hanging on to the status quo if finances were not threatened. But since the society was short of money, Hedrick viewed losing Seeley as a cost savings measure that would somewhat increase the burden of the editorials and necessitate the use of some small clerical assistance. AMS Secretary Richardson's list of Seeley's duties included managing the list of current and proposed members, sending out forms, notices, and reports, preparing official secretary correspondence, helping the secretary keep the calendar, prepare the agenda for council meetings, working up reports for society meetings for publication, reading proofs, aiding the investigation of committees, and writing letters and mimeographing reports. In contrast to Hedrick's evaluation, Richardson wrote that Seeley's duties for him, in only a small measure, can be classified as stenographic. They involve work each day for 12 months and must be undertaken on this basis. Losing Seeley, in Richardson's opinion, would throw a good deal more work on the shoulders of the secretary. Richardson relayed in a letter to Seeley a little later that, quote, with the exception of the Chicago people and Hedrick, everyone feels fully as strongly and some much more than I against the decentralization scheme. He quoted as an example a letter from William Fogg Osgood, former AMS president, that said, the really serious moment in the present situation is Dr. Seeley's resignation. Her services to the society are of great importance. She's had long experience in the affairs of the society. If she feels that the value of her services is called into question, set her right on this point and reassure her. Do what you can to keep Miss Seeley. Don't let her think of making up her mind to retire. The decentralization scheme was ultimately shelved, and Seeley remained in her position. The controversy surrounding this proposal, however, does give us a good sense of what Seeley's role at the AMS was at this time. In May of 1922, Seeley wrote Richardson describing her summer plans and explaining how she would continue to manage her myriad duties at the AMS. She wrote she would limit outings to weekends until Columbia professor and AMS treasurer William Benjamin Fite returned. Luther Eisenhart, Princeton mathematician and editor of the AMS Transactions, asked Seeley not to be more than a day's mail away from New York until the page proof of the January transactions is out of the way. She ended the letter with a postscript typed above the AMS letterhead. Did I forward you a letter from the Secretary of the London Math Society? Indeed, in her role at the AMS, Seeley was in direct communication with an international assortment of leading mathematicians. The secretary of the London Math Society she was referring to in May 1922 was none other than G.H. Hardy. In just one of her letters to Richardson that year, Seeley wrote of communicating with Henri Lebesgue about subscription agreements between the AMS and the French Mathematical Society, with Hardy about membership lists from the London Society, and with transactions editor Eisenhart about communications from authors Feit and Dunham-Jackson. Lebesgue and Hardy are now household names in the history of mathematics, and Eisenhart, Dunham-Jackson, and Feit were top American mathematicians of their time. Seeley skillfully managed communications between these mathematicians. She closed her letter to Richardson by reflecting that I seem to look on it as part of my job to pass on all gossip and comment to everyone on the principle that everybody ought to know everything. Thus, at the start of the 1920s, Seeley had established herself as a central and influential figure within American mathematics. Her multifaceted responsibilities at the AMS required not only clerical skills, but mathematical knowledge, political acuity, and skills in dealing with a wide variety of mathematicians. Her responsibilities had certainly grown beyond those of a clerk. What is clear, and what will be seen in more detail in what follows, is that Seeley was an active participant in decision-making processes at the AMS, even though her employment there was not in an official leadership position. The AMS Committee on Reorganization listed Seeley's duties for the Society's secretary, as well as its treasurer, librarian, publication committee, and shipping clerk. Although the president of the Society was absent from the list, Seeley did correspond and discuss Society business with Gilbert Ames Bliss, who served as president in 1921 and 1922. In 1922, Seeley noted that Bliss always answers letters eventually, but not so very promptly. When Oswald Veblen became president of the Society in 1923, Seeley had already generated high degrees of trust in her abilities from members of the AMS leadership. For example, in June 1923, Richardson wrote to Veblen that he had advised Miss Seeley to just go ahead and fill out a questionnaire from the League of Nations, even though it was addressed to Veblen. He continued, if you get a chance to go into the New York office, Miss Seeley can doubtless tell you lots of interesting things about the Society's business. Like other scientific communities, the American mathematics community was working to reinvent itself in the aftermath of World War I. Veblen was central to these efforts, and many of the changes for which Veblen is often credited were made possible through his partnership with Seeley. At this point, Seeley had developed deep institutional and interpersonal knowledge of American mathematics, and Veblen relied on her expertise during this time as president. Specifically, during his presidency, Veblen and Seeley worked together to complete the process of incorporating the Society, raise much-needed funding, and print journals on a tight budget. An important step in securing the financial viability of the Society was official incorporation. Although Veblen was president of the AMS when it was legally incorporated in 1923, the process had started well before then. A committee on incorporation was officially formed in 1921, and one of the first decisions that they needed to make was where to incorporate. MIT mathematician Harry Tyler would later provide his recollections of and advice about the process to the Secretary of the American Astronomical Society, Joel Stebbins. According to Tyler, it would have been considerably simpler to incorporate in a state where however, there was some sentimental objection to identifying the society with a particular locality before we appreciated how much time would be wasted in the alternative procedure of incorporating in the District of Columbia. Veblen, who was closer to Washington, D.C. than Tyler was, had the larger part of the detail work. In fact, a large part of Veblen's large part of the detail work was aided by Seeley. Throughout the process of incorporation, Seeley spent a lot of time explaining to other AMS leaders what the Society's new legal status would mean for its affairs. She explained to Richardson, for example, that being an incorporated body would affect the process of shipping publications internationally. While managing these details, Seeley maintained her sense of humor. At one point, she began a letter to Richardson with the quip, "I thought ladies were generally excused from having to read law on account of mental incapacity." She went on to explain that she had looked up Chapter 140 of the Education Law of 1910 and proceeded to tell Richardson about Section 68 on the powers of trustees. For the most part, the new AMS Corporation was the same as the old unincorporated society, and the bylaws were essentially copied over one from the other. When it came to the society's financial affairs, however, the process was more complicated. An incorporation required that a board of trustees assume financial control and liability for the society. Not only did Seeley understand this process, but she made sure other AMS leaders did as well. In October 1923, Veblen wrote AMS Treasurer Fite explaining, "I spoke with Miss Seeley about the details of transferring the funds of the unincorporated society to the incorporated one and asked her to bring the matter to your attention so that you would be in a position to take necessary action." Once it became a legal corporation, the AMS could then extend the efforts of its capital campaign and attempts to secure an endowment. A new standing committee on endowment had been formed near the end of the Bliss presidency in 1922. Initially, the committee focused on asking society members, especially the wealthier ones, to donate money. Another part of the campaign relied on donations from non-members and philanthropists. Industry leaders were approached, especially in fields with some sort of relationship to mathematics. But because it was illegal for corporations to give directly, the society decided to try selling its service as sort of a mathematical clearinghouse. For an annual fee, the AMS would direct a company like General Electric or New England Life Insurance to those who could help with their mathematical needs. In some cases, it seems that Seeley herself was the AMS clearinghouse. In August 1924, Seeley wrote to Veblen about how she had been dealing with multiple inquiries from Westinghouse. She joked that she was rather afraid of their contract and had been living in fear of more requests. Although these kinds of efforts towards raising funds for the society were helpful overall, financial challenges would continue throughout Veblen's presidency, and he would continue to rely on Seeley's advice and expertise. In a letter to Seeley from November 1924, Veblen made a suggestion about the society budget. At the end, he wrote, "If this is not clear or if you disagree with it, please write me further, for I'm conscious, of course, that you're much more familiar with these matters than I am." A central consideration in managing the finances of the society during Veblen's presidency was publication and printing cost. Indeed, nearly all of the society's income was directed towards printing cost, which had risen substantially in the aftermath of World War I, while the number of submitted articles waiting to be published was also on the rise. Managing this tension required a substantial amount of detailed work and negotiations with printers, funders, and mathematicians that was a central occupation of the Veblen-Seeley partnership. In general, Veblen learned many of the details about the printing budget and processes from Seeley. In 1923, for example, Richardson asked Seeley to explain to Veblen the discount structure that the AMS offered the Germanistic Society, which published subscriptions of the transactions and the bulletin for German and Austrian universities. In turn, Seeley wrote to Veblen with a detailed explanation of how many copies were sent, where they went, as well as approximate cost based on total cost of printing envelopes and postage per volume. This agreement formed the basis of further discussions about how to increase the prevalence of AMS publications in Europe. In a letter to Richardson, Veblen noted that Miss Seeley explained to me the arrangements that have already been made with the Germanistic Society and credited Seeley with suggesting that members could purchase transactions subscriptions to be sent abroad. This, Veblen wrote, is a method both of helping the situation in Europe and of helping the Mathematical Society. Later that year, the conversation changed from having AMS journals sent to Germany to having them printed in Germany. In September, quotes were solicited from various U.S. printers. It soon became clear, however, that the Society could print its journals for much cheaper with Lüdke and Wolf in Hamburg. As Hedrick explained, even with the added cost of duty, the Society might save $3,000 on the bulletin alone. By the end of October, the Board of Trustees agreed to make an advanced payment of $500 to the German printer to cover the cost of purchasing paper to print the Society's journals. As Seeley would soon find out, however, these advance payments would cause the kinds of complications she often encountered in her work. When she tried to send $500 to Lüdke and Wolf for volume 30 of the bulletin, for example, she learned that American Express would not issue checks in dollars to Hamburg. Instead, she had to purchase 10 $50 money orders, which cost $1.50 each. Moreover, because these payments were made prior to the printing of each edition, it was not always clear from which part of the budget the money should come from one year to the next. As Seeley would later explain to Veblen, if we have to pay in advance on paper for 1925 before the end of this year, the trustees will have to authorize it. We won't be able to get it out of the 1924 apportionment. Almost a year later, in June 1925, Seeley received word from Veblen that there were developments that would hopefully bring the printing of the bulletin back to the U.S. Specifically, Veblen had convinced the National Academy of Sciences to use funds provided by the General Education Board to help cover the cost of bringing the Society's printing back to the United States. Veblen had begun setting up this arrangement near the end of his AMS presidency in 1924, and to make it happen, Veblen asked Seeley to prepare an optimistic budget of the kind that I'm suggesting for the following year, allowing that she knew the Society's expenses better than anyone else. Seeley relayed these updates to Richardson and explained that the trustees had decided to move forward with the printing contract with George Banta Publishing Company in Wisconsin, even before the appropriations had been made official. If worse came to worse and the money fell through, they could pull from the sustaining membership fund. With the change, however, came quite a bit of angst. As Seeley wrote a few months later, I feel as if the change of bulletin from Hamburg to Wisconsin was an uncertain experiment. And unfortunately, by the end of the year, some of her concerns were borne out. Banta, I'm afraid, will bear watching. Not only did they do a particularly poor job with the transactions list, but also sent me a bill charging just 3 times the contract price for doing it. I am, of course, returning the bill, but I can see that we will have to check on everything in the future. In general, the Society's publications benefited from Seeley's attention to financial and administrative details. They also benefited from her attention to mathematical details. In one instance, while going over proofs sent by the printer, Seeley noticed that 2 different kinds of small alphas had been used in the subscripts and superscripts. She explained to Veblen that she thought that this was a big enough issue to ask the printer to fix it, given that a reader might think they're different objects. While thinking through the mathematical implications of the error, she kept the Society's financial interests in mind. I will tell the printer it's his fault and he mustn't charge for the corrections. During his presidency, Veblen relied heavily on Seeley's administrative, technical, and interpersonal expertise. Her skills were especially crucial in managing the Society's finances and publications, and her connections with other mathematicians helped develop a community of researchers. Both Veblen and Richardson, for example, relied on her close working relationships with the other mathematicians at Columbia, especially Feit and Cole. Seeley's letters described in-person conversations with both, and she was often asked by others to consult with them. She also kept track of other American mathematicians' interests, proclivities, whereabouts, challenges, and career paths. Although her mathematical expertise was most relevant to her editorial work, it undergirded these other tasks as well, allowing her to assess the broader mathematics community and to collaborate with other mathematicians on their own terms. Seeley's expertise and remarkable effectiveness in these and other matters were explicitly recognized at the time, as was her heavy workload. In October 1923, Richardson notified Veblen, "Seeley is getting $1,500. One of the matters I wish to talk over with you in New York is an increase in Miss Seeley's compensation." Later that month, the board voted to raise her salary to $1,800. While it's important to note that while many members of the AMS were on good terms with Seeley, she did not have smooth interactions with all members of the AMS leadership. Seeley's interactions with Hedrick in particular, starting in the 1920s and continuing through the 1930s, seemed to have been strained and a source of stress for her. Thus, the effective partnership that Seeley developed with Veblen and also with Richardson was extremely fortunate for the organizational health of the AMS and came to fruition at a critical moment in the development of the Society. The correspondence between Veblen and Seeley established that she had a substantial leadership role in the administration of the Society, not merely as a clerk carrying out directions, but as a partner in shaping and organizing the ever-growing business of the Society. Throughout Veblen's presidency, Seeley developed her expertise in several administrative domains. She grew to serve as both an arbiter for Society matters and as an advocate for and representative of the Society in the broader mathematical community. The 1920s were a critical decade for the AMS and the American mathematical community in general. Carolyn Seeley made countless contributions, both large and small, to the development and the professionalization of the AMS. While her administrative knowledge and expertise played a pivotal role in her contributions, her expertise as a trained mathematician was crucial as well. Indeed, the AMS recognized Seeley's skills as a mathematician by appointing her as a cooperating editor of the Transactions in 1924 and as an assistant editor of the Bulletin in 1925. As a member of these editorial boards, Seeley appeared on the journal title pages alongside mathematical stars such as J.H.M. Wedderburn, Tullio Levi-Civita, R.L. Moore, E.T. Bell, Marston Morse, J.R. Klein, Jesse Douglas, and Marshall Stone, among others. In his semi-centennial history of the American Mathematical Society for 1888 to 1838, Archibald lists Seeley as the only female assistant editor of the Bulletin and one of only 2 female cooperating editors of the Transactions, along with Olive Hazlitt, who served in this role from 1923 to 1935. Interestingly, while the title pages of the journals listed first and last names of editors, you're not supposed to do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to go backwards. Okay, first and last names. Okay, you'll notice that Archibald listed only first initials of the male editors, with the exception of Edward Kasner. We don't know why. While it spelled out in full the first names of Seeley and Hazlitt. As Ellen Abrams has pointed out before, Seeley had commented on a similar practice to Richardson in 1923 in the context of attendance list of AMS meetings. While finding the practice inconsistent, in the practice of listing women's names in full and not men's names, she commented to Richardson, but suppose someone in a strictly men's college should be so much impressed with a woman's abstract that he wrote and offered her a job, thinking her a man, and then had to back out of it. Seeley's comment reveals that she was acutely aware of the double standards related to gender amongst mathematicians. Navigating this unequal playing field represented a consistent tension for Seeley during her career at the AMS. As I mentioned in this talk's introduction, Seeley was often addressed as Miss Seeley by AMS mathematicians. Veblen's salutation to her was consistently, "My dear Miss Seeley," although his letters were sometimes addressed to Miss Carolyn Seeley and other times to Dr. For his part, Richardson often addressed and referred to her as Dr. Seeley. When dealing with other mathematicians, Seeley paid very close attention to proper titles. In an undated letter to Richardson, she mentions an AMS membership application made by the mathematical physicist George Uri Reinich. While she initially thought the title of master he used in his AMS application was a job, she realized later that it meant he had a master's degree as his highest degree. So, she wrote, he shouldn't be called doctor, according to his own statement. With her attention to protocol and mathematical detail, Seeley continued to serve as assistant editor of the Bulletin until 1934, the year she announced her intentions to retire from the AMS. She served 2 additional years as cooperating editor of the Transactions, well beyond her official retirement date of April 1st, 1935, and overlapping with the time that she started her chicken farm. Seeley's retirement resulted in a bumpy transition period for the AMS. In fact, beginning in January 1936, the AMS paid Seeley a retainer of $25 per month. As Richardson explained to Seeley, in case of emergency, the Society will feel free to call on you for assistance in its editorial work. In 1952, when she turned 65 and her retirement annuity began, the AMS finally ended its monthly retainment payment to Seeley. On this occasion, AMS Treasurer Albert Mader Jr. wrote to Seeley, reminiscing about the days when, instead of the extensive headquarters of today and the dozen or more regular employees, there was a small room on the top floor of East Hall at Columbia and Miss Seeley. Mater continued, though it's true that the phenomenal growth of this society and the inexorable passage of time has brought about a situation wherein most of the members would probably not even recognize your name, it's also incontestably true that these members owe a great debt to you. Seeley's influence, especially through her collaboration with Veblen during his AMS presidency, was substantial and central to the success and remarkable growth of the AMS. Between 1915 and 1935, the AMS transformed from a fledgling society into a professional incorporated organization that was prepared to play a major role in international mathematics throughout the 1930s and beyond. Seeley's partnership with Veblen helped bring about these changes at the AMS, which in turn shaped her role professionally as the administrative needs of the AMS grew in ways that outpaced the workload of a single staff member. While significant attention has been paid to the influence of Veblen, Richardson, Hedrick, and others during a time of critical time of growth at the AMS, Carolyn Seeley's role has been until recently neglected. Among her women mathematical peers, Seeley is an outlier, falling outside of existing narratives focused on women who were employed as teachers and research assistants or who were married to other scientists. Among those mathematicians who played vital leadership roles at the AMS during the 1920s, Seeley is an outlier with regard to gender, position, and status. However, she was an active mathematical researcher and editor and an important partner among the leaders at the AMS. Thank you.
Thank you, Sloan. We have time for questions.
Thank you, Sloan. So maybe you said it and I didn't get it, but did she continue doing research in mathematics? These papers?
She worked for about 15 years after her PhD, and then she stopped. Her last paper was 1931.
So thank you very much. That was fascinating. You put up the list of how her salary increased and relevant, relating it to today. And I just wondered how her salary was in relation to mathematics professors at the time.
And that's something I need to do. So yeah, and it is on the to-do list. Yes, but I'm going to write it
But I
down.
mean, that seems like
It seems kind of high.
yeah.
I mean, compared to mine.
Yeah.
I mean, they're quite difficult to use these measuring things, I think.
1,500 to 2,500 is a typical.
I think Reinhardt may have a
Yeah,
answer
just to this, I mean, I just don't believe it. Are you telling us this is a annual salary of $170,000 today, which is quite a bit? And I read the exchange thing, the value is 20 times from 1929.
Well, I'm using this website and take it. But I think what June suggests, just putting it in line with professors at the time.
Higher Burkhoff at the IAS, I think they offered him 5,000 around that time. So
Yeah.
that's
Half the salary.
That sounds kind of
That-
I think that would be
Half a
Paid
Burkhoff.
$340,000
and that would have been the top paid mathematician in the U.S. at the time.
Half a Burkhoff. I mean, yeah, that's still pretty good.
I think it's a lot. A junior professor would make 1,200.
Yeah, I mean, she's well, and I think that was our point. They really appreciated her. They really valued her. But I mean, she was literally doing the work of 2 or 3 people. When she retired, went to the chicken farm, she was replaced by 2 people, 2 women, Alta Odoms and two PhDs, or one about to get it. And anyway, they lasted like a year or 2. They didn't, but 2 people to replace her. So I mean, she was good value, even, but she was valued.
She could have a nice, her chickens were probably set up quite comfortably.
Well, and I thought this monthly retainer was also really the emergency retainer. Yeah.
Ursula?
I I'll stand up because I'm right at the back. Yeah, so, I mean, this is just an amazing story. Many questions pop up, but I was thinking of particularly Adrian's wanting us to identify emerging themes. And of course, quite often, when people do discover a hidden woman or a woman who people haven't thought about before, she is playing a significant administrative role in some kind of organisation. And what happens when you start to think of women like that more as a cohort, less as, wow, here's this exceptional one and here's that exceptional one, and you start thinking, actually, there are a lot of them about. And where had they learned their skills? I mean, some of the people I looked at in the UK had learned their skills, their administrative management skills, through women-only organisations, for example, or through leadership roles in schools or hospitals. And was there actually, there were, again in the UK, there were organisations for women businessmen or women, there was a whole. So they weren't entirely isolated people, although they're isolated when you look at them sitting stuck in this community of unappreciated guys. But
for sure.
So what do we know about that?
Well, so we have, the work from Green and Leduc. So, I mean, there were women PhDs in non-academic employment, but she was certainly the only one at a mathematical society. But yeah, you make a really good point that but she wasn't. I think I just see her as, in my group we've talked about that she's blazing a third path for someone with a mathematics PhD. You don't go into academia, you don't go into industry, you can go into this role at the AMS where you can keep up your research, and I don't know. It seemed like a pretty unique path. She did seem like a pretty unique person, but she certainly had. There were other women at the time doing things outside of women's colleges, and for sure.
Question here?
I'll stand up too. I'm wondering how the chicken farm did.
She did say she had a quote that she wrote Smith, a year later, and she said that she could probably write like a math book on chicken farming, whatever the cost that you estimate, double it and multiply by 1,000 or something like that. So she did complain that it was, that she had some growing pains with her chicken farm. But yeah, that's definitely, when I was looking for the chicken slide, I was hoping that, I'm going to look more into that. The chicken farming as a hobbyist chicken farmer myself is very interesting to me. So,
Matt, and then we'll go.
Just to follow up on Ursula's question, I wonder if it might be useful. One of the striking things about your presentation was how specific the kinds of labor she did. It was not just administrative, but she comes across as what an early modernist couldn't help but see, a kind of Oldenburg figure, wanting to connect people, and then dealing with the vicissitudes of printing down to typography. And it's kind of remarkable, but I suspect not. Because you have people like that, and then people in your list, and then you imagine like someone like Nina Rees, like just a generation later, who then becomes the heart of the American war effort, and then the funding of mathematical sciences is almost identical, sort of, different. So I wonder if we couldn't have like a taxonomy or a sense of the range of these. And she mentions at one point being a computer, but she clearly wasn't just that, whereas other women, that is what they are. So do you have a sense of that sort of distribution of different roles that were available to these highly educated women?
in mathematics?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, yeah. They could be computers. They could go into teaching roles. Let me see if I can. I have some. I wanted to stick to time, so I didn't give you all of the slides I could have. But is it? Well, there's a really good quote. I'm sorry. I did, while I'm looking for this, something we didn't mention about Seeley was that she also could translate. So she also did translation work, which was pretty clever. So I'm not gonna find the quote that I want, but yeah, definitely you could be more in the women's work, sort of computing, working as an assistant. You could be teaching in a women's college. You could, but Celia seems to be pretty original in her I like your Oldenburg comparison role for sure. She seemed to do really well with all the difficult mathematical personalities that would happen in a society.
Mathematicians are just
Yeah.
Yes.
I was also thinking about Oldenburg comment.
That's good.
So, woman with a doctorate in the early 20th century in the U.S. is about equivalent to immigrant from the lowlands in London in the 17th century in terms of, and I was like, that's an interesting transit, but that wasn't the question. I was really interested in her engagement with printers.
Yes.
In particular, I have some specific things, but I just want to know more about it. Were the printers bilking her more than usual? Was it because it was her, or was it because it was the AMS? And she seems diligent. Did she spend some time familiarizing herself with printing so that she could do this? Do you know anything about any of that?
She worked a lot with the printers. She also had to work with the duty. So when the journals were being published in Germany, there were all these rules, like the journal had to be stamped, printed in Germany. And she writes about having to go to the port with a stamp and stamping these journals that weren't stamped correctly.
How did she learn about it? Do you have evidence? No.
I don't. But yeah, that's pretty fast. And I thought that Ellen found the one with the. I'm not going to take credit. Ellen found the one with the alphas. I mean, that letter is just noticing the different. That was great.
The printer was ripping other people off, or just she was a special target? Or?
I mean, I think I was just looking at you because you've done work with print. You've done history stuff with Karis and stuff. Have you had? I think printers are just difficult.
Yeah, everyone always is complaining.
Everybody
about
complains about printers. I don't think it was gendered. I just think I don't know, but I just feel like printers are just difficult.
We should recommend the printing museum.
Yes. In Cambridge, there's they have lots of different printing equipment that you can.
Which gives sympathy for the alpha problem.
Yeah, I mean the printers had a hard time too. So I think it was definitely could be an antagonistic relationship no matter what your gender was.
In the early 20th century, which is when you are talking about, this was a notorious problem. Also at the monthly and also in journals in Japan. The Carnegie Institution of Washington was founded, and their biggest request was for subventions for journals. And the publisher of the monthly was just bilked by a printer and lost quite a lot of personal money. This created a very big problem. So I agree with you, Sloan. I actually I don't know any more than you just told us today, but I don't.
And I was wondering, it sounds as an assistant to the secretary, she did a lot of jobs that now the executive director and the CFO do. Do you know when the AMS, I should maybe not, started to have an executive director? Was that maybe even a consequence of her being so efficient, doing everything, that they afterwards thought, oh, we need a real hierarchy with executive director who works for the president?
Well, we did. You saw in the 1952 letter when they were, hooray, you're 65. Here's your. They said that the office then had 12, over a dozen people So some time in between those two. I don't know. Karen, do you know?
I don't know the exact date, but it's in Everett Pitcher's book on the second 50 years of the AMS. He's got it all laid out. I don't remember the exact year. I think it's after World War II, maybe 50, 52, that the executives are after. It's created, but it's in Pitcher.
And we'll have to end there. I'm so sorry. But please find Sloan during the rest of the night.